of historic forces, is inserted in it and works on it from within. It has, therefore, a form correlated to the contingencies of time and place, but it has at the same time an ideal content which elevates it into a formula of truth in the higher region of the history of thought. There is no way of exercising a spiritual influence on the things of the world by means of a human willpower commanding the wills of others, without first having a clear conception of the particular and transient reality on which the willpower must act, and without also having a clear conception of the universal and permanent reality in which the particular and transient reality has had its life and being. To know men, we must have a knowledge of man, and to have a knowledge of man, we must know the reality of things and their laws. There can be no conception of a state which is not fundamentally a conception of life. It is a philosophy or intuition, a system of ideas which evolves itself into a system of logical contraction, or which concentrates itself in a vision or in a faith, but which is always, at least virtually, an organic conception of the world. 2. Spiritualized conception. Fascism would therefore not be understood in many of its manifestations, as for example in its organizations of the party, its system of education, its discipline, were it not considered in the light of its general view of life, a spiritualized view. To fascism, the world is not this material world which appears on the surface, in which man is an individual separated from all other men, standing by himself, and subject to a natural law which instinctively impels him to lead a life of momentary and egotistic pleasure. In fascism, man is an individual who is the nation and the country. He is this by a moral law, which embraces and binds together individuals and generations in an established tradition and mission. A moral law which suppresses the instinct to lead a life confined to a brief cycle of pleasure, in order instead to replace it within the orbit of duty in a superior conception of life, free from the limits of time and space, a life in which the individual by self-abnegation and by the sacrifice of his particular interest, even by death, realizes the entire spiritual existence in which his value as a man consists. 3. Positive conception of life as a struggle. It is therefore a spiritual conception, itself also a result of the general reaction of the century against the languid and materialistic positivism of the 18th century. Anti-positivist, but positive, neither skeptical nor agnostic, neither pessimistic nor passively optimistic, as are in general the doctrines, all of them negative, which place the center of life outside of man, who by his free will can and should create his own world for himself. Fascism wants a man to be active and to be absorbed in action with all his energies. It wants him to have a manly consciousness of the difficulties that exist and to be ready to face them. It conceives life as a struggle, thinking that it is the duty of man to conquer that life which is really worthy of him, creating in the first place within himself the physical, moral, intellectual instrument with which to build it. As for the individual, so for the nation, so for mankind. Hence the high value of culture in all its forms, art, religion, science, and the supreme importance of education. Hence also the essential value of labor, with which man conquers nature and creates the human world, economic, political, moral, intellectual. 4. Ethical conception. This positive conception of life is evidently an ethical conception, and it compromises the whole reality as well as the human activity which domineers it. No action is to be removed from the moral sense. Nothing is to be in the world that is divested of the importance which belongs to it in respect of moral aims. Life, therefore, as the fascist conceives it, is serious, austere, religious, entirely balanced in a world sustained by the moral and responsible forces of the spirit. The fascist disdains the easy life. 5. Religious conception. Fascism is a religious conception in which man is considered to be in the powerful grip of superior law, with an objective will which transcends a particular individual and elevates him into a fully conscious member of a spiritual society. Anyone who has stopped short at the mere consideration of opportunism in the religious policy of the fascist regime has failed to understand that fascism, besides being a system of government, is also a system of thought. 6. Historical and realist conception. Fascism is a historical conception in which man could not be what he is without being a factor in the spiritual process to which he contributes, either in the family sphere or in the social sphere, in the nation or in history in general to which all nations contribute. Hence is derived the great importance of tradition in the records, language, customs, and rules of human society. Man without a part in history is nothing. For this reason, fascism is opposed to all the abstractions of an individualistic character based upon materialism typical of the 18th century, and it is opposed to all the Jacobin innovations and utopias. It does not believe in the possibility of happiness on earth, as conceived by the literature of the economist of the 17th century. It therefore spurns all the teleological conceptions of final causes through which, at a given period of history, a final systemization of the human race would take place. Such theories only mean placing oneself outside real history and life, which is a continual ebb and flow and process of realizations. Politically speaking, fascism aims at being a realistic doctrine. In its practice, it aspires to solve only the problems which present themselves of their own accord in the process of history, and which of themselves find or suggest their own solution. To have the effect of action among men, it is necessary to enter into the process of reality and to master the forces actually at work. 7. The individual and liberty. Anti-individualistic, the fascist conception is for the state. It is for the individual only insofar as he coincides with the state, universal consciousness, and will of man in his historic existence. It is opposed to the classic liberalism which arose out of the need of reaction against absolutism, and had accomplished its mission in history when the state itself had become transformed into popular will and consciousness. Liberalism denied the state in the interest of the particular individual. Fascism reaffirms the state as the only true expression of the individual. And if liberty is to be the attribute of the real man, and not of the scarecrow invented by the individualistic liberalism, then fascism is for liberty. It is for the only kind of liberty that is serious, the liberty of the state, and of the individual in the state. Because for the fascist, all is comprised in the state, and nothing spiritual or human exists, much less has any value, outside the state. In this respect, fascism is a totalizing concept, and the fascist state, the unification and synthesis of every value, interprets, develops, and potentates the whole life of the people. 8. Conception of a corporate state. No individuals or groups, political parties, associations, labor unions, classes outside the state. For this reason, fascism is opposed to socialism, which clings rigidly to class war and the historic evolution and ignores the unity of the state, which molds the classes into a single moral and economic reality. In the same way, fascism is opposed to the unions of the laboring classes. But within the orbit of the state, with ordinative functions, the real needs, which give rise to the socialist movement and to the forming of labor unions, are emphatically recognized by fascism, and are given their full expression in the corporative system, which conciliates every interest in the unity of the state. 9. Democracy. Individuals form classes according to categories of interest. They are associated according to differentiated economic activities which have a common interest. But first and foremost, they form the state. The state is not merely either the numbers or the sum of individuals forming the majority of a people. Fascism, for this reason, is opposed to the democracy which identifies people with the greatest number of individuals and reduces them to a majority level. But if people are conceived, as they should be, qualitatively and not quantitatively, then fascism is democracy in its purest form. The qualitative conception is the most coherent and truest form, and is therefore the most moral, because it sees a people realized in the consciousness and will of the few, or even of the one only, an ideal which moves to its realization in the consciousness and will of all. By all is meant all who derive their justification as a nation, ethnically speaking, from their nature and history, and who follow the same line of spiritual formation and development as one single will and consciousness. Not as a race, nor as a geographically determined region, but as a progeny that is rather the outcome of history which perpetuates itself, a multitude unified by an idea embodied in the will to have power and to exist, conscious of itself and of its personality. 10. Conception of the state. This higher personality is truly the nation, insomuch as it is the state. The nation does not beget the state, according to the decrepit nationalistic concept, which was used as a basis for the publicists of the national states in the 19th century. On the contrary, the nation is created by the state, which gives the people, conscious of their own moral unity, the will, and thereby an effective existence. The right of a nation to its independence is derived not from a literary and ideal consciousness of its own existence, much less from a de facto situation more or less inert and unconscious, but from an active consciousness, from an active political will disposed to demonstrate its right. That is to say, a kind of state already in its pride, in fire. The state, in fact, as a universal ethical will, is the creator of right. 11. Dynamic reality. The nation, as a state, is an ethical reality which exists and lives in measure as it develops. A standstill is its death. Therefore, the state is not only the authority which governs and